So good morning, everybody, and welcome to session 2 of the Board Leadership Program. I'm Mayor Schulman with the Hartford Foundation's Nonprofit Support Program. So just a reminder that the third and final session of the program will take place on December 11th from 8:30 to 10:30, also on Zoom. So as I've mentioned before, we've designed these sessions to be interactive. So we encourage you to keep your cameras on to the extent possible and to engage and ask questions as they come to mind. Very importantly, please take a moment and rename yourself to include your organization if you know how to do that. That's important so that we can get you in the right breakout room with your team as we go through today's session. And if you're a consultant who's here today, please rename yourself, followed by the word consultant. So in order to make these sessions as valuable for you as possible, we will be sending you a short survey immediately following each session. Please take a couple of minutes and complete that survey. We do read your comments and make adjustments to the sessions based on your feedback. As always, I want to thank my partner in crime, Monica, for all that she does to make these sessions run as smoothly and seamlessly as possible, even though there's lots going on behind the scenes to make it run well. So we've created a special web page for you with information related to the program, and we've sent you the link to the web page, and we'll also send it to you again following today's session. That web page includes the PowerPoints, the handouts, the recordings, a list of participants, and also information on the follow-up consultation that's available to all of you. So each of your organizations has access to up to 30 hours of a consultant's time to help you implement some of your learning from these workshop sessions. And there's a one-pager on the web page that describes the consultation and the consultation process. So we encourage you to review that document with your team and start thinking about that consultation. And in order to deliver the consultations, we have assembled a pool of consultants that have experience in board development, and it's up to your team to select the consultant that you believe is the right fit for your organization. And each of the consultants' bios are actually on that web page. A few of the consultants are with us today, I believe. So I'd like to quickly introduce them to you so you can kind of put a name with a face. So as I call them by name, I'll invite them just to quickly unmute and say hello to all of you. I believe, is Francine Christensen here?
Hello, how are you? Looking forward to this session. I always love what Susan Decker presents.
Thanks, Francine. And Kathy Cohen, is Kathy here? Kathy may not have been able to join this morning. I think Deborah Ferrand is here.
Hi, everyone. I was having a hard time unmuting. It's nice to see you and looking forward to working with you. Thanks.
Thanks, Deborah. And is Todd Pickens here?
Good morning. This is Todd Pickens, President of PTP and Associates of Hartford, Strategic Planning, Organizational Development, and of course, Board Development and Board Training.
Great, thanks, Todd. Are there any other consultants here that I've missed? Okay, great. So that's all I have. And Susan, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And I pay Francine well, just so y'all know. So thanks for the shout out, Francine. All right. So love that you're all here. Excited to work with you. Today, we're really talking about one of the really important roles that a board plays, which is in building a competent and effective board. So how do you as a board really work together to ensure that you're bringing people onto your board that have values congruence? How do you ensure that you are clear with them about what's expected? How do you educate and involve them? So everything about building a board, which I think is great fun. So I think Mayor said all of the things in here. The one thing I would ask is that when we go into breakouts, you're going to be within your own organization, that you ensure somebody's taking some notes, because this is information and these are starter conversations for when you get back to the full board. just giving you some insight into what was already discussed. This is, if you were here last time, I always start with a community agreement. And so I'm going to ask the same thing, which is if you are comfortable agreeing to this, if you could give a thumbs up. If you are not comfortable agreeing to it, a thumbs down, so that, because I will hold you to this. So if you have a chance to read it, and then you can do a thumbs up or a thumbs down. The moment I don't see any thumbs down. So I'm going to take that as agreement. We are going to jump right into a poll that'll start helping us. Today, there's going to be some breakouts and a couple of polls that'll just give us a sense of where we all stand. So let's start with this poll. And the question is, how easy or challenging or difficult does your board find recruiting new members? Give you a minute to answer this. Well, at the moment, the challenging is way ahead. So I'm going to end this poll. Can you all see the results or no? Let's put it up there. Can you see that now?
Yeah.
So 70% of you said challenging, and then more easy than difficult. So it doesn't seem like this is a bad topic to have today, right? If so many are finding it challenging. Those of you that are finding it easy, would any one of you be willing to unmute and just share a little bit about how it's become easy? I'm venturing to guess it hasn't always been easy, or why it's easy? Anybody willing to do that?
Sure. It's Mary Jane Foster at Interval House. We, some time ago now, over 5 years ago, learned a lesson that I think we all learn over and over again, which is that if you have a box that your board members, recruits, need to fit in, you will limit yourself. And so one of our board members said, I have a group of candidates for you all to consider. And they were young, they were racially diverse, not deep-pocketed, and in our little box thought, didn't have the Rolodex we were looking for. But what they brought to us was such a richness of diversity on every level that we have really never looked at board recruitment in the same way. And as a result, our eyes are open to all kinds of opportunities. And so rather than going to look for the seasoned, connected thing that we all think is the ideal board member, we're looking for people who are passionate, who care about us, and will be our advocates in the community. And it's made recruiting board members not only easy, but kind of fun.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary Jane. I have often said that the boards I serve on, I would rather have young, energetic, passionate folks than people who have a ton of experience sometimes, because the experience they have sometimes wasn't a good board. It wasn't, it's not the kind of engagement you want brought into the board level. So thank you, Mary Jane. That's definitely one way as we start thinking about building a sustainable board. All right, so okay, there we go. So actually, Mary Jane's touched on a number of these, right? Remember that I think the most important one is the question of where will your next generation of leaders come from? And so if we aren't at least occasionally recruiting younger folks, at some point that next generation of leaders is going to be tough to find. But as you think about the board, probably every consultant on this Zoom can talk about boards that have term limits but don't live by them, because they're like, oh, but if we lose mayor, we'll have lost too much. And so we get the people that have term limits, but they're not really living by them. And so we're really encouraging you, set those limits and then live within them. And also thinking about the fact that if we all look alike, think alike, talk alike, we're probably missing some opportunities, right? And be very clear about what it is you expect from board members. So there is something called the board building cycle.
Could I ask a quick question?
You sure can, Bob.
So I've actually run a couple boards where we've had term limits and one where we don't. And I actually was in a conversation with the president of the League of American Orchestras, who was also the board chair of the Madison, Wisconsin Orchestra. And he said to me, term limits are for wussies. Term limits come into play because you're not doing an effective job in board development. And that effective board development involves not only who you bring on, but who you move off. So I'm just curious,
Yeah. So,
how you feel about that, and where you've seen organizations work well without the limits.
yeah, great point. So it's interesting, Bob. I have an organization I work with who says something similar. They always say term limits really allow for bad governance, right? So
Right.
it's the same concept. So there, and this is probably in all of governance, probably this and whether or not board members should have to give money are probably the two most divisive, term limits and whether people should give money, two most divisive areas. So I obviously advocate for both good governance and I advocate for term limits. And the rationale for the term limits is that if we don't give more people, new people, the opportunity to care as deeply about the organization and have that fiduciary responsibility, then I think we are leaving passion and connectedness on the table when we could utilize it. It is for me, when I have an organization that feels very, very strongly about not having term limits, my thing is then let's make sure that we have a very strong evaluation process and that we do actually remove people. So it is not for me one that I'm going to die on the hill of, but I encourage it because I just don't know how, unless we just keep making the board larger and larger, I don't know how we give room for new people to feel that same level of passion and connectedness and to have that fiduciary responsibility.
Well,
Does that
I'm
make
wondering
sense?
if I think it does, and we're totally aligned on how we think about this. But um, term limits is one thing, and then you have the actual terms, and the symphony has 3-year terms. I think it's incumbent upon at least the executive committee, the governance committee, to look at each person and say, should we really reelect them, whether they've hit the term limit or not?
Exactly. I had an organization recently that had 3-year terms, and I asked them, I said, so you have a 9-year term? And they were like, no, we have 3-year terms. And I said, when was the last time you didn't automatically re-up someone who didn't serve out their full 9 years? And, they were like, well, Well, Bob moved. And I'm like, no, 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 no. I'm not asking about people who had to leave for different, but did you
Mhm.
ask to leave? And they said, never. We've never done that. And I said, was there ever a time you should have? And they said, yes. Right. And so to me, it's an annual review. Are people meeting? Are we setting expectations and are we meeting and then, evaluating those? So I think you're right. We're on that same page. And so when you look at this cycle, what you'll see is that's built right in. This whole concept we were talking about is built in, right? So it's one continuous cycle with 3 different phases and a total of 9 steps. So you can break it into threes. Okay. And we're going to look at each one of these in the next steps. So we're going to start with this concept of strategic recruitment. And within strategic recruitment, we're talking about identifying, cultivating, and recruiting people. And we actually start with what Bob and I were just talking about, which is let's assess our current board. Should those people continue? What skill sets do they bring? And I always encourage us to not get, and this is a little bit what Mary Jane was saying, don't get so focused on a skill set that we have to go find somebody who has a specific skill and only recruit them to that skill, because then when they don't engage beyond that skill, we're a little bit surprised. But if we've recruited them specifically to a skill, so what does your board have? What does your board need? And that, includes skill set, what kind of personal style do they bring in? What kind of lived experience do they have? But, assessing in general. And remember that you're going to get all of these slides. Oh, let me stop a second. Yvonne?
Yeah, thank you, Susan. It's interesting that you hit on this because at Interval House, we just had a board meeting and we were talking about this very thing. And part of our discussion for Mary Jane, myself as vice chair, and Tammy Dolberg as chair, we were talking about what do we have on our bench currently? What are the skill sets? What are the areas of expertise? And what don't we have? And thinking about board recruitment from that standpoint. So I think taking a look at the bench of who you have around you and what diverse talents and perspectives can be brought on to enhance the board effectiveness, the organizational effectiveness is key.
Absolutely. And so for those of you who aren't already doing that, here are some questions for you to think about, which is exactly what Yvonne was just saying. What do we need moving forward? If we think about board recruitment as part of our strategy to advance the organization, what does our compensation need to look like? And what might be missing currently from our group? We talked about this last time around, do we have history and habits that we should stop? And are there traditions that we should be building? And that question I asked earlier, like, do we know where the next generation of our board and board leaders are coming from? And so as a collective, whether it's your your governance committee or the board as a whole, teeing up some of these questions to kickstart the conversation of board building is a good place to begin. And when you think about what your mission is, that's your starting point. Mary Jane talked about, do we have people that are passionate, right? So it has to be people who believe in that mission, and using that as your recruiting tool is a great place to start. And we know that the more stories we have that we can tell about our organization and the way that the mission is put into practice, the more engaging it is for potential board members. And so if you think about where can you find prospects, where can you find them? Look at companies who are your sponsors. And I'm going to suggest don't always go for their highest level employees. Go for the people who feel strongest about your mission, but ask those companies who they know or who they might recommend. That CEO or the head of their marketing or their corporate social responsibility, they're going to know within their organization who they might recommend. Same thing, community leaders who attend your event. You don't need all the community leaders on your board, but ask them who they know, right? Or who they recommend. Same thing with donors who make meaningful gifts. Just because somebody donates doesn't mean they'd make a great board member. So ask them who they know and who they recommend. If you have a university, which I know there in your area, there are a few, what we know is that tenure track university faculty have to engage in community or have community involvement. And so find out who is tenure track that might have an interest in your area. And then don't be afraid to post something on LinkedIn saying, you know, the symphony is looking for passionate people to, you know, serve in a variety of areas. One might include your board. You're not promising them a position, but you're getting them to think about it. And the other is professional societies. If you're looking for greater diversity, there are a lot of chambers of commerce that are specific to various ethnicities. There are young professional groups. Don't be afraid to reach out to any of those kinds of folks. And when you think about who you want to bring in, part of what you're looking for is somebody who will serve as a connector, they don't have to have a huge Rolodex, but they are people who are willing to connect with other people, right? That are willing to talk about your organization. They might have influence in just their own area. We had a young couple in the town I live in that moved into town. They didn't really know a lot of people. Locally, they didn't have the kind of Rolodex that people, and some of you on this call don't even know what a Rolodex is. So a list of names, right, of connections. They didn't necessarily have that. But what everybody figured out really quickly when the first board finally took them on is that they were social media influencers and people followed them, and they honestly brought a lot of money in that nobody had ever touched before, right? So people that have just enthusiasm for your mission, okay? So the things we're really going to encourage you to stop doing is don't dumb down recruitment. Don't say something like, I have this opportunity for you. You don't have to do much, or it won't take much time. Let's not lead with that, right? Let's lead with all the reasons we want them to be part of it. To Bob's earlier point, if you have people that aren't showing up, address that. Either get them to show up or cut them loose, because you're taking up the spot of somebody who potentially would add great value. We already talked about term limits. If you do have financial obligations, if you do, then you need to hold everybody accountable to it. If you don't, that's fine too. But if you do have it, you need to hold everybody accountable for it.
Could I just wanted to add one thing to what you're saying. And this is something that I've observed in part because I've been on a number of startup boards where you have younger CEOs and who've never run a company before. So working with the younger population, and this is a generalization, which isn't always true. Whenever you generalize, that means whatever you're saying is false. But what I would find with some of the younger people is they were passionate about the mission, but they didn't want to engage unless they could see how they could personally have impact on the community. So they really wanted to look at the output that the organization was having in the community. And when they could connect the dots, they came in like gangbusters.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm looking for that passion, not just for the organization, but how they can impact the community. I
Yeah,
just wanted
Bob,
to share that because it's kind of, anyway.
yeah, no, it's a great point. And, recruiting the next generation and saying, the way you're gonna be a part of this is you're gonna come to 12 meetings a month or a year. And that's your contribution. They are not going for that. You are not going to find people, but to your point,
Correct.
where we can get them to understand, here's who we are and what we're doing and how you can impact that. Here's what it looks like. Being able to tell those stories becomes really important. Great. Thank you for that. So we're going to go into our first breakout, and there are 2 parts to the breakout. You're going to have 12 minutes. And so there's one question, and there's one where I'm asking you to think about what is the kind of the criteria for your next set of board members. So let me show you 2 things, okay? The first is we're going to have this question, and it's going to be in your, it's going to be in the chat. The second thing we're going to look at is the criteria for board recruitment. And these may or may not be. I just try to get us to think beyond just the technical skill, to get us to think about some of the other things we might need. But you have 12 minutes to do that one question, which again, this question, and then you're going to have a link to that criteria for board recruitment, and just think about some prioritization. Again, this is designed to kickstart the conversation, not to necessarily come to a full answer. And remember, because you have those consultant hours to use later, this might be something you want to build out with them as well. Anybody, any questions what I'm asking you to do? All right. Monica, are you ready for me?
It was so funny. I saw the button. I was like, blank.
That's great. All right. So hopefully this kick-started some conversations for you. You're going to have access to all of these slides, as you know. So just so you know, there are other questions built in here that would be kind of those next level conversations to have. So rather than give you 17 things to do while you were in the breakout group, narrowed it down, but you're still going to have questions about, what assumptions might people make about your organization when they look at your board composition? How are you making sure you understand the community that you're serving? Do you ever risk making decisions without really knowing how it would impact those that you serve? And if you were to make a deeper commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, what might it mean for your work and for the people you serve? So those will be included in this. And then here was this one. Did anybody add any other criteria for the board recruitment that you'd be willing to either unmute and share or drop into the chat?
The one thing I would share, Susan, is because fundraising is so critical to every organization, we've been starting to think about fundraising as both donor and fund development. And this isn't just about writing checks. And I think as we think about it as creating or strengthening a culture of philanthropy, sometimes we get a little too stuck on, well, we need people to write checks. And I was just curious whether you've seen that with other organizations and how other organizations are adapting to that, more of that culture of philanthropy versus just focusing on fundraising.
Yeah, there is. And again, with the next generation, They are interested in philanthropy. They are interested in building that culture. Arts and culture and private universities still tend to be the groups that most often are looking for board members who write checks. I still see that more often than others, but I think there's a shift away from that as well. And really thinking about how do we steward donors? How do we, as trustees and board members, really help cultivate those donors, not necessarily be just the person. You don't have to make the ask, nor do you have to be the person who writes the big check. And so we're seeing much more of this movement to, we need a board that can work together and work well together. And if we have people who want to be donors or people who have termed off our boards, we can keep them connected to the organization. They just don't have to be a board member. That's the biggest shift I think I'm seeing. Anybody, anything else? All right, so let's look at the second phase of this cycle is effective engagement. And that's looking at the three components within that are orienting, involving, and educating. So now we've identified, cultivated, and recruited our board members in. And hopefully, as we're recruiting them in, we're being very clear about what it means to be a board member on this board, right? What do we expect? What does engagement look like? So then when we get them onto the board, we really begin with orientation, and it's a two-part orientation, right? The first is to the organization itself. And that part is most often best delivered by staff, right? They're the ones that are living it 24/7. So they're going to make sure we understand what it means to understand the organization. We need to also orient to the board. What does engagement look like to us? How do we make decisions? How do we show up to board meetings? What's our committee structure look like? Who else is here? What are our bylaws? And that board orientation is best delivered by the governance committee, if you have one, or you can create a task force that is going to really focus on orienting people to the organization. We would also encourage that you think about a board mentoring program as well. And we often have board mentors. I will say some people use board buddies. Your next generation is not interested necessarily in a buddy. They are looking for mentorship. So my encouragement would be maybe to consider evolving to that language. But we can't just say, hey, you have a mentor. We need to give them a process, a simple process. The first is, don't just say who wants to be a board or who wants to be a mentor, because sometimes the people who say they'll be the mentor are not the example you want being made for somebody. So governance committee identifies who would be a good mentor. And it's a 3-step process then, right? You meet, and when I say meet, it can be a phone call, it can be via Zoom, it can be in person, but hopefully the agenda for the next meeting has arrived. And if Laura is from Main Street is my mentor, then Laura is going to say, let me give you some insight into what's on here. Here are things we've already talked about. Here's some history of what this conversation has been that's on the agenda. Have that opportunity to answer some questions. If you're in person, sit together at the meeting. If you're not in person, make sure that you either set up a chat for the two of you, or you share so you can text to each other if there are questions during the meeting. And then you meet after the meeting. Again, it can be a phone call, it can be email, but the new board member gets to say, gosh, here are questions that I still have, or here's something I wish I would have known. And that mentoring process happens for 3 meetings. The same thing happens for 3 meetings. And what we have found is that the board members' ability, the new board members' ability to really acclimate, become connected to the culture, feel connected to the organization increases significantly. So, and I think we have kind of a one-pager that describes it in the materials provided. If not, it really follows this. The second piece then is involving board members. Provide them opportunities, whether it's a committee or a task force. Make sure that you're engaging all board members in strategic conversations, that your board meetings are focusing on strategically where you're headed. And give them that opportunity. If you have a physical location where they can go to it, if it's an event where they can go in and really get exposure to the mission itself. Because otherwise, if they're only engaging at a board meeting, it can be challenging to stay connected to the mission. So when we involve people, we want to give them that opportunity to be connected to the mission itself. Okay. And then the last piece of this section is around educating board members. And so our encouragement is really build an annual board education calendar. If you meet 6 times a year, what's something that the board could learn about at each one? That could be, inside the organization. It could be a staff member coming and talking about how they deliver the mission. It could be about the mission itself, somebody who has benefited from your organization. It could also be about the nonprofit sector as a whole, right? So like what you're doing now, and so many of the programs that the Community Foundation, the Foundation for Public Giving offer, allow that education about the sector as a whole. So taking advantage of that. Ask board members, what do they want to learn about governance so that you can build out that calendar? And then these kinds of professional development opportunities. But oftentimes we get people onto the board and it's like we expect that everybody gets it all. Like we already understand it. Let's keep building our governance muscle, build our board muscle, right? And so if you think about an engaged board, right? Every board needs a coach. It's usually the board chair who reminds us why we're here, what we're doing, right? We need people who are the analyzers, the analysts, right? The people who can peel back the onion. We need people who observe before they jump in, like, let's see what the lay of the land is here. We need reframers. We need people who say, I heard what Kathy said, and I heard what David said. And if we take those two together and do this as a result, like reframe what people are saying, we need people who can put all those disparate parts together, right? The synthesizer. We need then the healthy skeptic. The person who says, but what if? Are we thinking about this from all the right sides? Have we missed something? We used to call these people devil's advocates. And then as we worked with religious groups, they didn't like that verbiage so much. So I don't know if healthy skeptic is the best description, but it is that kind of but what if person, right?
Susan, I refer to that as risk mitigators.
Well, and I like that. I actually like that a lot. I might have to put that in there. we need the, hang on, mitigator, sorry. Thank you. We need the person who can help facilitate, who encourages others to engage. We also need, obviously, to pay attention to time so that we're not spending hours on one thing. So good facilitation skills. Typically, we're hoping for that from the chair, but anybody can help with that. And then the norm keeper, the one who will remind us, like, we're getting into the executive's lane right now. We need to stay in our own lane. Or the person who says, you know, gosh, we haven't seen Annette at a meeting lately. This might be a governance committee. Like, we probably ought to reach out to her and see what's, you know, preventing her from being able to show up. Or we made that decision last meeting, we shouldn't be revisiting it. Anything around norm keeper. So you're going to find there's a one-pager of this in your materials that give a description of it as well. I like to use it, the boards I serve on, we use it in our recruitment to say, this is we're looking for people who would engage in this way. And that's very different than just asking somebody to serve on a board, right? You're helping them think about how can they add value. So let me stop there before I get to the last phase. Any questions, thoughts, challenges, concerns? Morgan.
Susan, I was doing some reading recently, and they made a suggestion of orienting folks before you accept them on the board, and I kind of wanted to get your feedback about that.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad idea at all. In fact, I think there's one level of orientation you do before. I'm not sure it's worth doing the full orientation, because if they opt out, then I don't know what the total value of that. But I do absolutely believe that we need to be much more robust in our recruitment. And that's why I say, like, showing this sort of thing or talking about here's how we work as a board. I do think it's important. Like, I would never join a board if I didn't have some understanding ahead of time about where they are financially, where they're going strategically, how I would fit into that. So Morgan, I think that's a spot on approach.
And do you see that happening one-on-one, or is that more like, hey, we have a group of 5 prospects that we might consider and we're going to do it all together?
I think you can do either, but I think you always need time with individuals so that that individual understands why they're specifically being recruited, and then bring them into, if you have a pool of 5 or 6, then you could do that together. But does that make sense? That individual time, I think, is important as well.
And Susan, just to add, I think all of these are great questions, some of which could form the basis of the consultation, the follow-up consultation with the consultant, really sort of fleshing out what does your recruitment and orientation process look like, which items are shared in advance, which later. So all good thoughts to kind of cook on in terms of the consultation.
Yeah, great point. Thank you, Mayor. All right, so if we look at that last grouping, it's around intentional revitalization. And our earlier conversation leads directly to this, right? Around let's evaluate, rotate when appropriate, and then celebrate. So when I think about just evaluation as a whole, it's really, at the end of the day, how do we build a culture of inquiry? How do we build this space where we assess how we're doing individually, we assess how we're doing as a board, how our meetings are working, because we measure what matters. And let's be clear, boards are doing really important work. And so it does matter how we do. And so we would suggest that there's assessment around each of these things, right? And then when you think about, we've talked about rotation, right? Term limits, measure people, determine whether or not they should be part of the organization moving forward. But then let's also make sure that we're celebrating people. There are, I have colleagues who will say, when people are rolling off, oftentimes in the nonprofit sector, we give them a plaque, and then it's like we smack them on the head on the way out, right? Plaque them and smack them. So that's not what we want to do, right? We want to make sure that we're really celebrating the good work of the organization and celebrate the good work of individual board members, both while they're on and as they're terming off. And if we think about, the life cycle of a board member, you've got all of these components, right? And as you think about them, I'll share with you that the most critical one that we have found is the second one from the left, affiliation. How are we ensuring that board members feel like they are part of the mission, part of the organization, connected to that mission? And if we miss that part, you can have a great orientation. People can be like, yeah, I'll serve on a committee. They might even want to build their resume, so they'll serve in a leadership position. But without that affiliation component, they don't engage as deeply as they could. And so as you're building your board, think about, how are we helping a board member feel connected to the organization? Are we building it into our meetings? Are we building it into our orientation? How are we doing that? All right. So we're going to go into the second breakout, and we have 10 minutes for this conversation. So you can answer each question, decide the time, but or you can pick one. It doesn't matter to me, but I would say start at the top, because I don't want you to spend a lot of time deciding which question to go after. 10 minutes, you could do both. So how are you engaging board members? What else could you do? And how are you celebrating? All right, anybody, any questions what I'm asking you to do? All right, we'll see. Welcome back, everybody. Anybody want to share out about ways that you are engaging board members that might just be something others weren't aware of or hadn't considered? Yvonne.
Yeah, so we started something at Interval House recently, helping to better orient our new board members and build a culture within the board where we're actually taking time to get to know each other a bit more personally. So we have this segment in the beginning of our board meetings where we have certain questions that are not just focused on our careers, professional, why we're on the board, but more about who we are as fellow humans. And that we are already seeing the fruits of that bear out, that people are feeling much more connected to one another. They're sharing and exchanging, and the thought and the kind of the research behind it supports that the more connected that we all are to one another more interpersonally, the more apt we are to engage, the more apt we are to show up for different opportunities to engage as board members and to support one another.
That is awesome. I use them all the time. Things like, what's a piece of advice you were given at some point in your life that is stuck? Or what makes you lose track of time, which was my favorite answer. I may have shared this with you all, but we had a woman in her 80s out in California, a board member. Everybody kind of lost it because I asked that question, like, what makes you lose track of time? And her answer was, I can just spend hours on TikTok. And everybody was shocked. Like, it was, but it's those things that connect us. What's your favorite, what book, movie, song brings a smile to your face, right? Love
Yep.
that. Love that. Tressa? Or is it Teresa?
It's Tressa, you're correct.
Okay,
So
perfect.
we did an activity at the beginning of kind of our school year because that's kind of when we kick off, I guess, the year where we're on like a school year schedule. But we had all of our board members and our staff members fill out these sheets, get to know you sheets. And so it had some basic information, but then it had some really fun facts. And so we were able to have our board members either do that in person or they could fill it out digitally. It had a photo of them. And so we printed those all out, put them up, in our main conference room. And it was just really fun to learn some, new facts, favorite foods, type of music, both with the board and the staff. And I think the staff really appreciated seeing some of the things about board members they didn't know, and vice versa. Board members really loved getting to know our staff a little bit more intimately. So it was just really fun. They're still up. They'll probably come down in the next couple of weeks, but it was just really fun to see everyone
Yeah.
go in and read all of that.
That's great. Thanks for sharing.
So if anybody wants the template, I'm more than happy to share it.
I'm sure they would love it. That's great. Thank you. Annette?
Thank you, Susan. So one of the things our group talked about, which we haven't done, and we're now going to do this, put it in place, is we're going to have a team building exercise for the board and the CEO. And it's called a pasta dinner, where you actually create from scratch, all the board members in a kitchen, the dinner, and then you commune together and you have conversation to really get to know each other in ways that you don't when you just see each other 4 times a year at a board meeting or at a committee meeting. So that's something new for us to try this year.
Thanks.
To help the board work together.
That's great, right? Like, I think to all of your point, anything where you have that opportunity to connect people together, engage them with each other and with the mission is important. We'll take David as the last one here. Great to hear from you, David.
Yeah, hey guys, thanks. Really quickly, it's interesting. Some people may be familiar with the Urban League's equality sign. It's a circle with the equal sign inside of it. And one of the things that I have noticed is that people really want the lapel pin, like particularly board members. And so they're always anxious once they become a new board member to get this pin. And so, one of the things I've thought about is they come in different sizes, a smaller size and then a larger size, which typically is worn by CEOs or what have you. But I thought about creating some type of a kind of sending context for that, where be the different colors that represent the number of years you've been affiliated with the Urban League or something like that, so that there's some type of aspiration that goes with the excitement about getting the first one. There's some excitement about getting the second and third one. So just one thing that I kind of picked up on, but trying to figure out how to perhaps level that up or institutionalize it so that there's this continued representation or signaling with the lapel pin that I see that the board members kind of are drawn to.
Yeah, David, that's awesome. And I love that aspirational component, right? So not only am I part of it initially, but as I work my way through, that's that deeper level of engagement. Great idea. Great idea. Very nice. All right. So let's wrap our heads around for the kind of remaining time about succession planning. And it's a really critical role for the board to ensure the continuity of the organization, right? So as the fiduciaries, it's not just thinking about today and looking inside the organization and looking backward, but really about looking forward. And so one of the things that we know happens is that we can get really caught up in everything we're doing and kind of forget to think about succession planning and that transitional, how would we transition our leadership? So we're going to use one more poll here, which is the question of, does your organization have a succession plan for the executive, for the board chair, for both, or for neither? We'll give you some time to answer it.
Neither isn't a choice in the poll.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. If you are a neither, don't answer it, and I'll ask afterwards.
Can we put it in the, you want us to just put it in the chat if it's neither?
Perfect. That's a beautiful idea. Dejan, thank you. So we have a couple, two or three neithers. We have 19. Is that everybody that's participating? Do I need to give you more time? All right, I'm going to give you about 20 more seconds and then I'm going to end it. All right, so let me share this with you all. So 60% for board chair, 25% for both. And those of you that are the executives on this board, you can't go away for all of those other organizations, right? All right, and none of these are unusual, right? So let's talk for a minute. When we think about kind of why succession planning, it really at the end of the day is about how do we create the organization that has just the basic level of health, that has stability. But we want to go beyond just that basic level of stability. We want it to become a sustainable organization that, really is strong and is going to be able to continue. And then ultimately what we're looking for is an organization full of vitality. And so I would say that the basic level of health is having those succession plans in place. And the best day to create a succession plan for your executive is the day they're hired, right? If we know that we have a succession plan in place from the time they're hired, it's much easier. The second best time to create a succession plan is now. And so again, if you don't have a succession plan, thinking about your work with your consultant, that's an opportunity to have them help you build that out. We would tend to look at it in kind of three ways. The first being that there's a succession policy, just the overarching policy, and then the actual plan that spells out the who's and what's of it. And then always having a leadership development plan. Like, how are we really, and I can't remember who said it earlier, it might have been Yvonne, talking about kind of that bench strength. How do you ensure that you're building people for the future? And so for you as a board to have some conversations around, let's ensure that we have better succession if we don't have a good solid succession in place now. Let me stop. So Jane, sorry, I just saw your hand.
No, that's fine. Thank you. I was just thinking, so the SINA, which is the organization I'm on this call for, is a relatively small organization. We have 16 members. When you think about executive succession for a small organization, it's different than, like, I'm employed at Connecticut Children's Medical Center. We have 3,500 employees. It's a very, thinking. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how to think differently about succession planning, depending upon how big your bench is.
Yeah. So what becomes sometimes even more important in the smaller organization, because you'll often have, well, there's not a clear, like, if you're thinking executive succession, there's not a clear number two, but it becomes a question of, that's why kind of that policy becomes important. Who would help make those decisions? Oftentimes in a smaller organization, the board has to step in and be more engaged than they were. And then once you get a new executive in, then it becomes really important that the board, transition and step back out. You could, as an organization, have the policy that you would bring an interim executive in, where again, you don't necessarily have a solid number two, or it's a very small organization where everybody else is doing a very job specific or program specific job as opposed to that overarching. But I would suggest that's why it's even more important for small groups to have some of that conversation. I'll give you some more specifics in a moment, I think, Jane, but that's the starting pieces. I think that's why it's really critical. 3,500 people, you surely can go find somebody, right? To an organization of 5 or 6 people, now that's more challenging. Bob?
I was just curious. This is one area where the for-profit and the not-for-profit are diverging. In the for-profit world, we refer to this as business continuity planning, which is much more comprehensive than just succession planning. I've looked at, the ability of organization to sustain themselves when you've got a leader that has never documented what they do. And that's actually good practice just for general business continuity, and it helps with succession. But I'm wondering if we really need to expand this topic into more of a continuity discussion than succession only.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And so I think as you see some of the questions we have, that's what we're really asking. We're starting with, so let's be clear. When we look across the nation and look at any of the places, Board Source, Compass Group, Stanford Social Innovation Review, the ones that are doing the research around the nonprofit sector, we still have so few that even have any kind of leadership succession. So it's almost the low-hanging fruit. I can promise you when I'm working, for instance, individually with organizations, we are always looking much deeper at that business continuity, with leadership succession being one piece of it. So I love that you bring that out, and I think that becomes aspirational for organizations. So whichever you start with, I think your point is well made. Thank you. One of the things that you can do, and Jane, this can even start the conversation in a small group, is at the board level, like, what if somebody said they were leaving? What would you do? What would you need to be prepared for? So it's just having some of that conversation, so then you can start talking about what might it look like. But if we don't have the conversation, then we get caught when somebody leaves. This starts going, a bit to the conversation of the bigger picture. How much are we really investing in our organization, in our staff, in building out leaders? I was just at an organization this past weekend where the CEO said to me, we were having a conversation about actually business continuity, and one of the conversations was about her senior leadership team and about succession. And she said, well, my senior leadership team, there isn't really anybody that could step in. And so my question was, well, is that because you're not empowering them, or do you not have the right people? Because if you actually have a group called the senior leadership team, 5 people, and the comment is there's nobody who could step in an emergency, then there's something wrong. right? But it's these kinds of questions that get us thinking about these kinds of things, right? You also can talk to another board if you know that somebody's gone through a transition recently, and ask them, somebody from their board, to come talk about what did it look like? How did they do it? We can learn from each other and not feel like we have to have, all of the answers. And if we think about an executive transition itself, it really can become a strategic launching pad, right? So thinking about who do you need for who the organization is going to be, not who the organization is today. And if we think about, if you really want to have the greatest success around leadership succession at the executive level, do we really understand their job? This goes to Bob's point. If nothing has been captured, because I'll promise you, whatever job description you hired them in with, if you haven't looked at that job description in the ensuing time that somebody's been there, that job description probably isn't accurate anymore, right? So do we understand, really what their job is? Do we as a board agree on the expectations we would have for an executive moving forward? What kind of, thinking about what that profile would look like, what the goals would be. And then as we hire them, what's our orientation and onboarding plan going to be? So at that highest level, as we think about executive succession, we're going to go into a breakout for you all. This is a kind of quick hit one. It's about 5 minutes, but my question to you is, question number one, who knows what we would do if an emergency impacted our executives' ability to do their job? These other two questions are going to be questions for to use in the future. But like, what would you do if your executive, if they were that lucky one who won that just under or just over $1 billion Mega Millions last week, and they're not coming back for a while, maybe not ever? Like, what would your organization do? All right. So you got about 5 minutes for this conversation. Anybody questions what I'm asking you to do? All right. We'll see you back. Hopefully none of the executives were bothered by this conversation. In fact, I would suggest that most executives would love to know there's a succession plan in place because it can help them sleep easier at night, right? Because they care deeply about that organization. But we oftentimes hesitate to have these conversations because we're afraid the executive will think that means we want to get rid of them or we're not happy with them. But it's really about saying, you are doing such a great job that we want to ensure that we have a plan in place should, you need that bolstering. So the next part of succession is really about the board leadership, right? So, one is about the board chair specifically. But when you think about board officer succession planning in general, right? Do you have a succession plan? 60% of you said you have one for the board chair, and there was another 25% that said you had both. So this one seems to be one that you have given more thought to, or it's built into your process, right? But so let's say your board chair became unable to serve. Is the next person really ready? Do they have kind of the knowledge and bandwidth to be able to step in and lead the board? And if they don't, what's your development plan for them, right? And does everybody know who would step into that position? I think about this with the executive or with a board chair. If you all remember back when Reagan was shot. Some of you weren't born, but for those of you who were born, when Reagan was shot, I think it was Alexander Haig announced that because he was at the White House that day, and he's like, I'm in charge now. Like totally skipping, the policy, which I think he was 8th down the list or something. But so do people know who's going to be stepping in to either, the executive or the board chair position? When we think about a board chair, oftentimes boards don't put the thoughtfulness into electing a chair and really thinking about what we need from a chair, right? So do they really embrace the mission, vision, and values? When we look at them, do we see them as really connecting with it? Do they understand our programs and services? Do they understand where the organization fits within the community itself? And when we think about kind of those, what are the leadership skills we need from a board chair? We don't want to just say who's willing to be the board chair. We know that sometimes it's hard to fill that role, but in the long run, these personal qualities around really being somebody who can facilitate and draw conversation in, who's going to be respectful and show integrity, be both a student and a teacher. We really need those components, right? And we need them to kind of make some commitments. And we would suggest it's a robust, but an important list, right? So you don't want somebody, I had a board recently, and I gave him credit for saying it out loud, but I was like, okay, can we think a little differently? They said that they had selected their previous chair because he could get them in and out of the meeting in 1 hour. That was their criteria. And it was like, but how well did you use that hour, right? And so we're really looking for people to truly be a strong leader. And if we think about this, how are we really going to make sure that we have a good process? We have to know what the term limits are for the board officers. We need to find out who's interested. We really should have the same kind of vetting process as we do for bringing somebody onto the board. Why does somebody want to be the chair? What skill sets do they bring to it? All right. And hopefully we have enough people interested that we have nominations. And if you have a vice chair to chair, is that a chair-elect who automatically moves into that spot? That becomes an important question. And so when we think about building that leadership pipeline, you really want to make sure that as you invite people to serve on your board, you're acknowledging that you need people who will serve in leadership positions, right? So that you're building a pipeline from the very beginning. And you'll see, we're saying again, let's assess and let's have a process. Other things you can do to help build that pipeline are many of the things you were talking about around engagement, right? But allowing people to serve on committees, to serve as leaders on committees, giving them that opportunity to demonstrate to the board as a whole that they'll do what they say they're going to do, that they can actively, engage a group. And as always, like with what you're doing through Mayor's programs, Monica's programs, is attend trainings, right? Continue to develop that skill set. For my own professional development, I spend all of my professional development dollars these days on continuing to learn facilitation techniques. Even as somebody who facilitates all the time, it's like, I know there's new ways of doing things. And so what are some of the things we've learned over time? Make sure the person that's in there is really doing what you need them to do. And if they're not, that assessment piece says, let's find somebody who's going to be able to do it. So we're going to go to our last breakout. There are 5 questions about board succession, but we're only focusing today on the first one, which is, do you ever really talk about what you need from a board chair? Or is it just, well, who's going to be the chair? And so the conversation needs to be, what do you need? So you've got about 5 minutes to have a conversation about what do you need from a board chair. You may already be getting it, you may not, but what do you need as a board from your board chair? And board chairs, just as the executives listened before, add in, nobody's trying to get rid of you. Nobody's saying you're not doing a good job. We're just going to have that conversation about what do we really need? All right. So you got about 5 minutes for this conversation. So again, sometimes we just don't take the time to necessarily have these kinds of conversations. And building this kind of strategic thinking into your board work can really allow you to add much greater value down the line. The other questions, which again, when you get this slide deck, excuse me, and somebody asked about it, you absolutely share these like with your board. We've got a total of 5 questions. I think number 3, what's the executive's role, if any, in this process is an important one to have a conversation about. If you elect somebody as the chair that, we talk about that constructive partnership, it's important to think about how will this chair interface with the executive? How do you determine if somebody should have another term or not? And if there is a transition, how do you help ensure a smooth transition? So those are the questions. Again, with your consultant or over time, you can have some additional conversations about. Bob.
You're on mute, Bob.
You're muted. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry about that. I was just going to share something. It became very clear to me in the work I was doing coaching in the startup community, where you're working with companies at different stages of development. And one of the observations I have is coming out of COVID, we were going through a period of rebuilding the board. So the types of leaders you need when you're going through a building process versus one which is more sustaining and operating an effective board are different skill sets.
Absolutely. And I think, Bob, that's the very reason that having the conversation about what do we need today, what do we need moving forward. I can't remember off the top of my head if I shared this with you all. I'll write a note. I'll make sure I get it to you if I didn't. Is the nonprofit life cycle that has all of the organizational elements and then has the descriptors, which talks about what do we need given who we are today in our life cycle. So the difference between being a startup, being in growth, being mature. And again, I know I said this last time that, we're a team that doesn't always practice. Just having some of these conversations opens up that opportunity for us to hone and really crystallize what is it we need and not just kind of do what we've always done. So I appreciate that comment, Bob. And so, as you think about just our need to really develop bench strength. If we're not doing that, then a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we're not going to have the kind of leadership we could have. You have 3 local resources, which I think are really important resources to consider in this whole succession planning process. And so the Executive Transition Program offered through the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, the Leadership Greater Hartford, which I know somebody mentioned earlier, and I was glad that got called out, but Leaders on Board program, and then the Pro Bono Partnership. And again, great opportunity for you all to utilize your governance consultant around this conversation if you would like. Questions, comments, challenges, concerns?
I'll just share a comment. Jenna from Fresh Start Works. I never had thought about, as an executive director, what would happen if something happened to me health-wise and I wouldn't be available for months. The only context I ever thought about this for, if someone was to move on from a position, but I never thought about, and I guess, no one wants to think about something bad happening to them. But at the same time, it's really, really opened my eyes because you just don't know. And it's going to take some work on my end, but I really need to create a policy and a process for, getting access to the things that I use every single day, passwords and user IDs and, who our insurance brokers are and all that sort of stuff, and get that in a one-stop shop because I never ever. So I really appreciate you just bringing up that particular point because it's just really opened my eyes. So thank you so much.
Awesome. Jenna, you made my day, right? Like made the whole, not that it wasn't worth it before, but like that's what we hope happens, right? Is that it gives people another way of thinking. So we have a session, the last session coming up on December 11th. You have homework. I don't usually give homework, but this is the teacher in me that's still coming out. Your homework is, I want you to identify 3 words that describe your board's culture today. And then I would like you separately to identify 3 words that are aspirational. What 3 words do you wish you could use to describe your board's culture? And we're going to be using those during one of our breakouts on December 11th. Okay, anybody questions what I'm asking you to do?
You mind if I jump in and ask a question, Susan?
Sure, Steve, absolutely.
At the risk of sounding nitpicky, can you define the word culture as you'd like us to consider it?
The way in which the board works together, the way I don't know, how do I define culture? I think I would say the way you work together, the way you make decisions, the way you show up. That's how I would describe it.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Or Steve, Google it, Google culture and use whatever you want to use. I think it's going to be fine, whatever you do.
Operates.
Yeah, how it operates. Good. Thank you. Check. So here's your next one. I think I've gone over time. Mayor, I didn't leave you any time, so I'll be quiet.
No, really, nothing much from me. Just thanks to everyone for being here today. Please fill out the survey that we will send you. And I think Monica is also putting in the chat. And we'll see you on December 11th and start thinking with your group about the consultation. If there are things you've heard and you think this is where we'd like to focus. So talk with your team a little bit about where you might want to focus that consultation, and we can talk more about it at the next session. So thanks everyone for taking the time to be here today, and we'll see you on December 11th.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
And if anyone has a lingering question you want to talk to Susan offline about, you can stay on.
Absolutely.